Believe it or not, but what you're seeing before you is one single material. The snow, the grass, the rock, even the water, all within one material. This is the node graph that makes this material, and it's entirely procedural. So if we were to go into sculpting mode and let's say for instance move this little pillar down, you can see that the snow cap is disappearing because the snow caps are being applied based on the actual mesh's height. Now, this material is rather heavy on your PC, so once you've made it, it's advised that you actually do bake it into a texture map, which I have a video all about that if you don't know how to do that. But there are ways to make it more optimized, and let's get into how to actually make this. So I already have some hills set up here. If you don't know how to make hills like this, it's relatively simple. We're not going to go over it today because we've got plenty of things to talk about. I do have a link down below in the description how to make sand dunes. The same technique can be used to make hills like this. So in this new material, we will start by adding a color ramp. That color ramp will go into the base color of our material, and we're also going to add a gradient texture. The gradient texture is going to, with the color, go into the factor of the color ramp. Now, you can see that this creates a gradient from pure black all the way over on this side to pure white all the way over on this side. This is a color ramp going from 0 to 1. It might look like it starts being white somewhere around here. The actual point where it's pure white is at the very edge. Same thing with pure black. Make sure you have the add-on node wrangler enabled. You can go into add-ons, search in this little bar here for node, and enable node wrangler. If you have that enabled, you select a node and press Ctrl T, you'll get a texture coordinates mapping. You can manually put in these nodes and connect them, but just enable the node wrangler. It's one of the most useful add-ons Blender comes with. We're going to change this from being generated to being objects. And what you'll see now is that the black line is in the middle of the object. That's because right now it's going from -1 to +1. You can't see negative values there, so it's all just black. We're going to rotate things around a little bit though, so we're going to rotate 90 degrees along the y-axis, and now if we play around with this color ramp, you can see we have a way to make masks. We can increase the height of this, we can increase the sharpness of it, and this is the mask we're going to use to start making our snowy peaks. So the way we do that is relatively simple. We start by getting 2 RGB nodes. One we're going to make white and one we're going to make our green grassy color. Then we're going to get a mix RGB node where the snow will go into color number 2 and the grass will go into color number 1. The color ramp output is going to go into the factor input for the mix node, and then the mix node's color output is going to go into the base color for the principal BSDF shader. And just like that, we have green hills with snowy peaks. Now, we can repeat this process as many times as we want. I can copy over this mix RGB and this RGB node by just copy pasting, plugging the last mix RGB node into color 2, and putting the output into the base color for the new one. Then just simply also copy the color ramp. Don't forget to connect the color into the factor here, and use the second new color ramp as the factor for your second mix RGB. So now we can make this whatever color we want. Let's say we want to have this a brown rock-like color. And if we start moving this down, you can see we now have rock on top of our grass as well. Doing this one more time, we can also make the water. The water is very important that you don't make the gradient very gradual. You want to have it very, very sharp for the water. Not too sharp, but you do want it to have a very sharp edge. And this more or less is it. But there's still one huge issue with this material, right? Because all of the edges here are very, very sharp. And if we just go into side view mode, it's just layers, right? We've got a top layer here, and then we've got a middle layer, then we've got this layer, and then we've got a little bit of a water layer. But that's not how things look in the real world. That's not how nature works, right? Things aren't in exact straight lines. We want a little bit of distortion along those lines. And that is where we get into the next step of this process. Before we move on though, probably a good idea to clean up and make a little bit of extra room in your node graph, because you do want things to still be somewhat readable. And move this gradient texture and texture coordinates node a little bit to the left, because what we're going to do is we're going to add a noise texture. And then we're also going to, just from here, copy over a mix RGB node. We're going to drag that over. And then we'll plug this color gradient into color 1 in the mix RGB node. And then the factor of the noise texture will go into color 2. And then that output will go into the factor of the color ramp instead. And you will see there is a less straight line. But this is not really what we were looking for, is it? Well, if you hold Ctrl and Shift and then click on the color ramp node, this only works if you have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled. Again, it's a very good add-on. So click on the color ramp, you will get a preview of just that node. So everything that's going into this node will be taken into account, everything after this node will not. And from here we can start playing around a little bit with the factor of this mixing node. Because if we set this factor to 0, the noise texture will be entirely ignored and we just have the straight line we had before, as you can see. Then if we set the factor all the way to 1, it'll just be the noise texture. The gradient texture will be entirely ignored, and that's not really what we want either. So you're going to want to have a nice mix of the two, where things are not quite straight but also not overly distorted and all over the place. Then we can Ctrl-Shift-click on the principled BSDF shader itself again, and we can see the snowy peaks now have a little bit more distortion to them, and they look a lot more natural. You might want to play around a little bit with the contrast on the edges now, but we'll still have a little bit of a problem here, right? Because while the edges themselves are not very straight anymore, they are still relatively smooth. And we probably want this to be at least somewhat more jagged. So the way we do that is we just select the noise texture and the mix RGB node, we copy and paste, and then we hook up this mix RGB node's output into the new one's color 1, and then we use that output for the color ramp instead. And this at first won't do anything. Now let's preview the color ramp again, and we can start increasing the scale of this noise. And as you can see, it's making the edges a lot more jagged and a lot more detailed. You can also play around a little with the roughness and a distortion maybe if you want, but do leave that alone as much as you can, because usually that ends up looking really weird real quick. And then playing around with the factor a little bit. Again, if we just set the factor to 0, it'll just be the output of this node. But if we just add a little bit of it into here, things will look a lot more jagged, more distorted, and more the way you expect a snow peak to look like. And now we have some reasonable snowy peaks. Again, you're going to want to fine-tune your actual snow here a little bit, of course. And you can just copy over these 4 nodes and paste them over here and use them for the transition between the grass and the rock as well. You're going to want to be a lot more subtle with this one, because you really don't need as big a transition here. And the transition between the rock and the water, you don't want to do that with, because again, you really want that to be a very harsh line. But all things considered, this is all you have to do to make this mixed material. And then of course you can also use these masks to apply some normal maps to add a little bit more detail to this, have different roughness maps. This is just the mask you use for everything regarding the snow layer. This is the mask you use for everything regarding the grass layer. And this one is the mask you use for everything regarding the rock and water layers. So real quick, just as an example, I'll copy over this noise texture node over here, and we'll preview that, and we'll make it a very high scale. That looks about right. So now we'll get a bump node and use the factor from the noise texture to go into the height. Then we'll get a mix RGB again. You can just use mix RGB even for normal maps, because at the end of the day, it's just 3-dimensional data. So RGB works perfectly well. This was the mask we used for our snow layer. So we'll drag this color all the way down there to the factor of this mixing node. Then we'll put the normal into color 2, and then the output of that into the normals. And now if we preview the material, you can see that there is a noise pattern normal on the snow, and only on the snow. if we copy this setup over here a little bit and we change it to being something that is a lot less small, something like this for instance, and we hook that up into here, we can see it's a very bad example, obviously, because this is not very well made now, but we have the very small fine detail from our one noise texture in the snow, and the rest of everything is using the much bigger noise texture that we have down here. So if we start playing around with this, you can see it's not affecting the snow at all. So if we start playing around with the strength here, you can see first the snow peaks disappear, then grass disappears, and eventually even the ground disappears, and we can make something real weird going on there. Of course, for these noise textures, what you really want to do is also add some texture coordinates so that they don't get stretched out, but again, that's more detail oriented right now, doesn't really matter. And in a nutshell, this is how you make something like that.